In a world where nothing is known, nothing is certain, reality is not real. Wake up! Be afraid of nothing. I'm Bob Heskey.
Robert.
The host with the ghost.
This is my podcast, based on my paranormal documentary, Afraid of Nothing. Each episode, we talk to people who see life and the afterlife through a different lens. Join me.
Who is this large man? And what's he doing in our bedroom?
As we lift the veil and open our minds to see beyond our eyes lie. This is Afraid of Nothing.
Science fiction writer and futurist Robert J. Sawyer has been interviewed for over 350 times on radio, over 350 times on television, and countless times in print. He is one of only 8 writers to ever win all 3 of the science fiction field's top awards for Best Novel of the Year. The Hugo, which he won in 2003 for Hominids, the Nebula, which he won in 1996 for The Terminal Experiment, and the John W. Campbell Memorial Award, which he won in 2006 for Mindscan. In 2014, Robert J. Sawyer was one of the initial inductees in the Canadian Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame. And in 2016, he was made a member of the Order of Canada, the highest honor bestowed by the Canadian government. According to the Locus Index to Science Fiction Awards, Robert J. Sawyer has won more awards as a science fiction or fantasy novelist than anyone else in the history of those genres. And ladies and gentlemen, we've got him with us today. Robert's newest novel, The Oppenheimer Alternative, was released on June 2nd. All right, welcome Robert J. Sawyer. Tell us about your latest book.
My latest novel, it's my 24th, is called The Oppenheimer Alternative. The Oppenheimer of the title is J. Robert Oppenheimer, who 75 years ago this summer was responsible for the creation of the world's first atomic bomb. He was the scientific director of the Manhattan Project. In real life, he came very quickly to have regrets about what he had done. He felt possibly the bombing of Hiroshima was necessary, but not Nagasaki, and certainly not the Cold War arms race that he precipitated by creating the atomic bomb. So I've written an alternate history novel in which he gets a chance possibly to find some redemption. He most famously said at the original Trinity test 75 years ago, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I wanted to give him and his colleagues, Leo Szilard, Enrico Fermi, Edward Teller, Hans Bethe, all the great physicists of the early 20th century, a chance, if they succeed, to turn that around and say, now we are become life, the saviors of our world. That's the Oppenheimer Alternative in a nutshell.
That's awesome. And, I'm all for throwing in plugs because I know people are probably listening and some people may want to jump and listen to it right away. So could you tell us quickly where they can get your book?
Absolutely. The Oppenheimer Alternative should be available in any bookstore. It's published as a science fiction novel, so that's the section you'd look in for it. Any bookstore that doesn't have it can certainly order it. It's available, commercially published book. Of course, the ebook is available on whatever your favorite platform is, Kindle, Kobo, Nook, Apple Books, you name it. And the audiobook, which is not read by me, but by a very fine narrator who does all the different European accents of all these great physicists, is available from Audible and from iTunes and wherever it is that you would normally buy an audiobook.
That's so great because Audible is one of the sponsors. So that's awesome.
I'm just doing a deal then with Audible. We haven't announced it yet. The deal's coming out soon, but it's fair enough to say there'll be a very big original to Audible project coming from me, Robert J. Sawyer, later this year. I'm an early adopter of Audible. I have back in the day, you may remember this, Robert, they had their own MP3 player, the Audible Otis. before anybody had an iPhone, right, or anything like that to play the material. Yeah. And I have the original Audible Otis. I'm one of their original customers, and now a couple of decades on now it is. I'm very happy to be one of their content creators, original content creators.
Well, you definitely should be because you're a prolific writer. 25 books now? Is that what
Well, this is my 24th novel is the Oppenheimer Alternative, but I also have 3 short story collections. So if you want to beef up the number, I say I have 27 books. But
all right,
a couple of dozen is a good quantity for a career of a writer, I think.
Yeah, you were cranking out almost one a year, and then, there's a little hiccup or some personal stuff I think probably got in the way, unfortunately, but you are very much the definition of a prolific writer.
And I'll just say, because whenever somebody says, oh, was he put in jail for something? What was that personal? Very sadly, my younger brother was diagnosed with lung cancer. And he had that journey that ends predictably for lung cancer diagnoses, going through that to some degree with him. And then just it took the wind out of my sails, the way it took it right out of his lungs. So yeah, there's been 4 years since my last book.
Wow.
And it's good to be back in the saddle. It's good to have a new book out, and I'm writing the next project now. So all of that feels good. But you're absolutely right. You reach a certain point in life, Robert. I'm 60 years old now, where those tragedies, the loss of both parents recently, also a sibling, those things start to slow us all down as we get older.
Yeah, I have to tell you, that's why I did the documentary Afraid of Nothing. It's really a kind of a metaphor or a statement of half the world thinks that there's nothing when you die. The other half thinks that there's nothing to fear. So I had lost a mother probably about 5 or 6 years ago. She was battling a lot of things. The final nail in the coffin was Alzheimer's. And when she passed, there was like no magic. There was no special thing that happened, and it left me kind of empty. And I was kind of searching, and lo and behold, I have 2 daughters. One is one's 14 now. The youngest is 12. The youngest is autistic, and she had some kind of paranormal stuff going on with her. And my wife had invited a shaman to the house, and he was quite an interesting character. And I thought he would be a cool person for a documentary because he had kind of a turnaround in life. In midlife, he was a rock merchandiser for the first part of his life, and then he had this kind of awakening, and he became a shaman, and he kind of learned stuff, but he felt like he was relearning stuff he already knew. So that got me on my journey to doing my documentary and this podcast. So yeah, that when mortality hits, it's a tragic thing, but it's sobering, but it also makes us appreciate things more. One thing I've noticed in doing some research on you, you've said something I thought was really cool. You said that science fiction writers make the best futurists. You want to tell our listeners why that's so?
Sure. Most futurists, this is the job essentially invented by Alvin Toffler with the nonfiction book in the 1970s that became a New York Times bestseller, Future Shock, the idea that somebody could, look at what was going on in science and technology, but also in society and political trends and so forth, and try to predict the future in a rational fashion and say, here's what's coming down the pike, and it's going to come way faster than you expect. That's the shock part of Future Shock. The future is going to gobsmack you way before you expect it to. The problem with most futurists is that they think of the first order ramifications of anything they're considering, not the second or third order, by which I mean the second wave, the third wave, the things that are going to come. In fact, it wasn't so much later that Toffler wrote a book called The Third Wave, with actually thinking about later ramifications of futurism. The science fiction writer, the great quip, and I wish it was mine because it's so good, but it isn't. Anybody in the beginning of the 20th century could have predicted the airplane, but only a science fiction writer would have predicted frequent flyer miles and airport frequent flyer lounges, and that the food would be so lousy, and so on and so forth. So the science fiction writer we've always been, we're not beholden to a corporation. We're not beholden to a particular party that happens to be in power this given electoral cycle. Our job is simply to do the freewheeling thinking of not just next fiscal quarter, not just the end of this particular democratic mandate, but the next decade, the next century, and even the next millennium, where things are going to go. And that gives us a bigger perspective, and B, a freer rein in our speculations than almost anybody else who purports to be able to do an extrapolative vision of the future is able to bring to the table.
Now, of all your 24 books, which one, looking back, are you probably most proud of, and you feel like, wow, I really hit the nail on the head on that in terms of seeing how things are today or how you think they're going to evolve?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because unlike a lot of my colleagues, starting about 20 years ago, I made a very deliberate effort to write near future or present day science fiction rather than far future spaceships and aliens. So for a lot of my books that I wrote 20 years ago, the date in which they were set, which might have been 5, 10, 15 years in the future of when I wrote them, has now come and gone. So we actually can do this assessment. I wrote a novel that came out in 1997 called Frame Shift, and it was about a couple of major issues. One was that it was going to turn out to be incredibly valuable to insurance companies what your genetic information dictated about what your future is likely going to be, and would spark a huge debate about whether or not having a genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's, as you mentioned earlier, or cancer, as I mentioned earlier, really constitutes a reason to deny you life insurance. And the notion that still is very central in this upcoming presidential race in the United States of whether or not the only thing, and I contend it is, the only thing that makes sense in an era of predictive genetic testing is socialized medicine, is everybody pays into the same pot and everybody takes out if and only if they need to from that pot. And that's a book called Frame Shift, term from genetics, frame shift, one word.
That's great. One thing I was thinking about, is it harder being a futurist today as opposed to the 1990s when you first began writing? I know you're not looking too far in the future, but things are really shifting in the business world. I mean, digital acceleration is a whole new thing. Businesses are transforming much quicker than they ever thought they had to. So is it tougher for you to be a futurist now because things are changing so quickly?
Things are changing at an ever-accelerating rate. You're absolutely right that makes it difficult. That said, what I have found, and I do a lot of keynote addresses for conferences, and I name these clients not to say that they were the bad examples, just some examples. Lockheed Martin and Sloan Kettering Cancer Research Center, New York, and NASA and IBM and all kinds of places that I've given talks to over the years, Google. What's astonishing is, although all of our tech leaders are very cognizant of how advanced our science and technology actually is, what we saw during this COVID-19 pandemic, Robert, is that so many people were unaware that video conferencing was a mature technology. They might have tried it 20 years ago and said, well, that's nothing. Or they might have tried voice recognition 20 years ago and said, well, that hardly works. Or OCR, optical character recognition. Well, it's, you might as well just retype the thing. All of these technologies that are incredibly mature simply weren't impinging on the consciousness of the average Joe or Jane until suddenly they had to start working at home. And, this COVID-19 crisis that we're going through right now would have been pretty unbearable 10 years ago. But now, because the technologies are so mature, we're actually managing to keep a large part, not all, but a large part of our economy going. So yeah, absolutely. When you talk about the future, and I had to take Margaret Atwood to task for this when she published Oryx and Crake, which is now 15 or more years ago, she would have all these things that she was saying I was asked to review the novel for the Ottawa Citizen, the largest circulation newspaper in Canada's capital city. She had all these things that she was putting forward as if they were science fictional inventions. And I had to say in my review, all due respect to Margaret Atwood, the great Canadian writer, but this already exists. That already exists. We've had this for 5 years. You're not even writing about the present, and you're purporting to package it as the future.
Yeah, that's incredible. Things really do move quick. Getting back to the science thing too, I was reading up on you in many places, including Wikipedia and interviews and things. If I understand correctly, your work frequently explores like the intersection of science and religion.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts, for the people that don't know your work well? Why does that interest you? And do you think, as a second part of the question, can science and religion coexist? And the last part is, do you think religion is still alive today, or is it kind of dying on the vine?
Oh, so these are a number. Each question could be an hour. So let's do it very quickly. First, I would say, you mentioned I've won all these awards as a science fiction writer, but I'll tell you one of the things I'm most proud of in my life is that the University of Winnipeg, which is the largest university in the Canadian province of Manitoba, a very respected Canadian university, gave me an honorary doctorate. Well, that's nice in and of itself, but it was jointly sponsored by the Dean of Science and the Emeritus Dean of Theology, specifically because those two departments used my book separately in courses, and those two deans recognized that I had paid great respect to their respective positions, right? And, Stephen Jay Gould famously said that he wrote a book with this title, Non-Overlapping Magisteria, which is a fancy way of saying, you stay at your end of the pool and I'll stay at my end of the pool, right?
Yep.
Which was his position that science and religion had no overlap. You might ask of them the same question, but the answers don't overlap at all. And this, Gould was let's use the word advisedly, a saint of the secular humanist / new atheist movement. And that resonated with a lot of people at the far extreme of atheism. But there are an awful lot of intelligent people who feel that a quest for understanding, for meaning, not just the next, Gould said, science can tell you how, religion can tell you why, and you can't ever mix them together. Well, actually, there's an awful lot of science that will tell us why we are altruistic, for instance. It's an empirical question. We don't have the answer yet or not. You alluded to it earlier. Is there life after death? There either is or there isn't. It's an empirical fact, one or the other, right? It's testable hypothesis. We don't have the tools to test it yet. I wrote a novel in which those tools became available. It's called The Terminal Experiment, about a scientist who discovered scientific proof for the existence of the human soul. We will either prove or to the extent that you can disprove anything. You can't prove a negative, but you can show it's so outrageously unlikely given all the places we've looked for this and not found it. We may reach that point at some point, but we're nowhere near that on whether or not consciousness persists after death. It's a perfectly valid spiritual question, and it is also a perfectly valid scientific question.
Now, could you say again the title of that book you mentioned? And second part to follow up on that would be, did you learn anything as you were researching or writing it?
Yes.
Surprise that changed your point of view?
Sure. The book, which is the one that won me the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America's Nebula Award, the Academy Award of the science fiction field, it's called The Terminal Experiment. The Terminal Experiment, it came out in 1995, and I won the award in 96. And I'll tell you where absolutely I learned an enormous amount about that. The genesis, if I may use a religious term for the book, was a little bit before that. So the early 1990s, a bunch of thoracic and cardiac surgeons in England, the United Kingdom, had said they were going to refuse to perform heart transplant operations until the government had come up with a definitive determination of when the donor was actually dead. Because, of course, we do beating heart transplants. So the standard classical definition, does he have a pulse? No, he's dead. Yes, he's not. He's alive, right? Never pertains with a donor. You take the beating heart, ideally, out of the chest of somebody who's on life support and put it still beating into the thoracic cavity of somebody who needs it. So I got quite fascinated in looking into the fact that really it's been a matter of judicial fiat from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, what constitutes being dead. But there's nothing that satisfies in the religious sense. I was with my mother-in-law just, my God, this year's gone by very quickly for all of us. It's now 9 months ago. It seems like just yesterday when she passed away. And there was no light moving out of her body that I could see. There was just she'd been breathing, and she died of a COPD, chronic respiratory disorder. And the raggedy breath, there was one in, one out, one in, one out, one in. And that was that. But is that what moment, at what millisecond was her brain still functioning? Just because she wasn't breathing, you can be underwater not breathing for 2-3 minutes without any brain damage whatsoever. So we don't know. And this to me was revelatory, that we have all of this discussion of life and death, but the demarcation line is still, it was up for debate 25 years ago when I was researching that book, and it's still up for debate. And there are those who will argue from a quantum mechanical basis of consciousness or what have you, or any number of interpretations, that there never is a demarcation. There may be a death of the physical body, but there may be no death of the specific individual.
Hey, everybody. This is your paranormal podcast pal, Bob Heskey. You know, every night I like to listen to videos on YouTube. But lately, with COVID, civil unrest, market volatility, politics, conspiracy theories, I just want to tune out. That's why I like Audible. What's Audible, you say? Audible is the leading provider of spoken word entertainment and audio books, including some great horror and paranormal titles like A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay, If It Bleeds by Stephen King, and The Boatman's Daughter by Andy Davidson.
This place is cursed.
Each month, members get 1 credit to pick any title, plus 2 Audible originals from a monthly selection, access to daily news digests if you actually want to hear the news, as well as guided meditation programs. Hey, we all need a little Zen now and again. And Audible is oh so easy. You can download titles and listen offline, anytime, anywhere, on any device. The app is free and can be installed in your smartphone or tablet. You can even listen across devices without losing your spot. How cool is that? If you can't decide what to listen to, no problem. You can keep your credits for up to a year and binge on your favorite series later on. So, here's the rub. The Afraid of Nothing podcast is stoked to partner with the audio bookworms at Audible to offer you a free 30-day trial membership. Just follow the link in the show notes, audibletrial.com/AON podcast.
Puedes repetir eso, por favor.
That's audibletrial.com/AON, all caps, podcast, lowercase. Full disclosure, I get a commission for everyone who signs up using that URL. But you get to try it for 30 days without a commitment. Using our custom URL doesn't cost you a penny and helps out the show if you do sign up. Nothing scary about that. So escape reality and pick up a book, an audiobook, and listen to what's out there. Go to audibletrial.com/AON podcast after listening to the show. Also, in a lot of your writings, you seem to have an interest in consciousness studies, which is great because in the documentary we cover that a lot, and in several of your books, probably most notably Mindscan, though there are others. You kind of explore the uploading of human consciousness with AI or even onto the World Wide Web.
Mm-hmm.
As a futurist, do you see this happening in our lifetimes?
So my background is actually, it's funny, we're recording this and I'm watching the waveform go across Zencaster's screen here. My background is in radio and television arts. I was a radio documentary writer and producer for the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, in the 1980s. I did some, not a lot, but on a freelance basis. It was one of the jobs I did. I know nothing about musical genius. I cannot sing. You would be mortified if you asked me right now to sing my favorite song. You wouldn't even recognize what tune. I'm that bad. But as an audio engineer, to whatever degree of fidelity you request, assuming I have the right equipment, I can flawlessly reproduce any live production of, let's say, musical genius, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, in digital form. You tell me what level of fidelity, what bit rate, what you want, and I can give it to you. So you don't have to understand musical genius to reproduce musical genius in a digital form. Well, I happen to be of the school of thought that believes that whatever it is that goes on in or around our bodies that constitutes our consciousness is ultimately explicable scientifically. That doesn't mean it doesn't have a spiritual or a religious angle. It simply means that just as nobody argues anymore about how the heart works, they used to in the Bible, how does the heart work? What's going on there? What does it do? We know exactly how the heart works, and nobody says that's diminished the value of talking metaphorically about the heart. I feel the same way about consciousness. So unless one postulates that there's something extrinsic to our universe, something beyond human realm of comprehension in terms of consciousness, then I say, of course, absolutely. A sufficiently technologically advanced engineer with sufficiently technologically advanced equipment should be able to reconstitute any consciousness that exists now or even existed in the past in a digital form.
Like AI, for instance, with their consciousness, like, for example, my consciousness is probably a narrow band of all that's out there.
Right.
It'd probably drive me crazy if I could pick up everything. AI consciousness, would you see that being much broader and more kind of visceral, or would you think it would be it would start off on the same bandwidth as human consciousness?
So I've written about I think there are two different kinds of AI consciousness. One is where, and I did a trilogy about this, Wake, Watch, and Wonder. As you will notice, the titles begin with the letters WWW.
Yes.
It's about the World Wide Web gaining consciousness as a single entity.
That's a great concept.
Versus the alternative, which is that someday your Roomba and your, I'm not even going to say her name, she's sitting on my desk here, but my Amazon digital assistant, and every other, your thermostat, and they'll all have some degree of consciousness. Now, if you take either model, it really doesn't matter. It's going to be fundamentally different from our consciousness. Our consciousness evolved in a Darwinian world of survival of the fittest, which really means survival of the nastiest. Darwinian evolutionary competition is, if I can take all the food and make sure that my offspring survive and your offspring starve to death, then I am definitionally fit and you are definitionally unfit. That's Darwin in a nutshell. So we have a nastiness underscoring our consciousness because of how it arose. A digital consciousness arises in a completely different, I'm going to use the word economy or ecosystem, one of absolute plenty, the one that we all strive for, that hope that, Star Trek shows us in the 24th century, in Star Trek The Next Generation, an economy where whatever you want, we will just replicate it. I grew up, and my ancestor, Australopithecus, grew up, that if there was a piece of food and I had it, you didn't have it. Any digital consciousness will grow up where if there's a piece of information and I have it, you can have it too at the same time. And so can any arbitrary number of others at the same time. There is no competition for resources. So although we have made a whole industry in science fiction out of why we should fear artificial intelligence because we project upon to them our own rapacious, evolutionarily driven survival of the nastiest psychology, I don't think there's any particular reason to think that AIs would have any of those negative traits.
Yeah, unless it's programmed into them, I guess.
And that's an excellent point. Let's not run past that too quickly. So much of our AI research is done by the Department of Defense in the United States or the Departments of Defense worldwide, or by military contractors without public oversight and without a lot of concern. There's no question that our most sophisticated AIs these days are drone killing machines. They exist. They are used. They have made the decision that an acceptable number of collateral casualties are allowed. So yes, if we program into them a nasty agenda, garbage in, garbage out is the fundamental principle of creating computers. Whatever you put in ultimately is what you're going to get out.
So if AI becomes nasty and destroys its creator, it's our imprint that's probably the cause of that.
It's our fault. That's right. Because there's no natural inclination on the part of an AI to be competitive. I can't think of any reason why it would. I remember, and you'll remember this too, it was probably 15 years ago now, Time Magazine, their Person of the Year. Do you remember when it was you?
Yeah.
By which they meant the collaborative online communities that had given us user support forums for all of our software, that had given us Wikipedia, that had created reams of original content absolutely freely available through YouTube. Where there's a natural inclination in the online world to disseminate and share for free. And yes, we will possibly this decade and certainly this century share this planet with other thinking, feeling, self-aware beings that have a different evolutionary background from us.
You know, you mentioned your trilogy, and I thought, wow, having consciousness being uploaded to the internet is kind of like Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity, you know, because everything is one, but it's all shared.
So I know Ray, but I gotta say, Ray is riffing on my colleague, Werner Vinge, who proposed the singularity first. And Ray certainly made a fortune writing The Singularity is Near and going in the talk circuit about it. But the actual notion of the singularity is from a University of California, San Diego computer scientist who also is a very fine science fiction writer, Werner Vinge, V-I-N-G-E. But yes, Ray has definitely been the number one popularizer of this notion.
Yeah, that's always the case. Someone takes the idea and runs with it, and whoever can manufacture it into the greater awareness and capitalism wins out.
And I only make this point so dramatically because as a science fiction writer, we are so used to seeing people, whether it's Elon Musk or somebody else coming along and presenting watered down, lukewarm versions of ideas we had half a century ago as if they are great technological prophets. Anyways.
If consciousness can be contained outside of living, breathing humans and can be in the digital world, what about things like love or even having a soul? Any thoughts about that, or is there kind of a limit to what the digital world can upload?
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? And the answer is, and it's the same answer I give, by the way, Robert, when somebody asks me, do you believe in aliens? The answer is I say, no, I don't believe in them because we don't have any firm evidence that they exist. But I don't disbelieve in them because we have no firm evidence that they cannot exist. So the only sensible position to take, since we have not yet identified the physical instantiation of the soul in our world, is to say, I don't know, maybe you can upload it, maybe you can't. But until we define what it is, it's impossible to answer that question. And again, I tend to be, and I don't use these terms pejorative, a reductionist or a materialist. I tend to believe if the soul can in any way influence the material world, which it does, presumably, we say, okay, it is my soul, my innermost self that is making me choose to perform an act that in some religious teachings will be judged on whether or not it was a worthy act or not, right? There has to be a mediation between the soul and the physical reality. The soul must interface with physical reality, and by far the simplest way to interface with it is by being part of it. So from that point of view, I say it seems prima facie at first blush. Sure, absolutely. Their love, the soul, if it can exist in a human being, why can't it exist in other life forms and in artificial existences as well?
This may be kind of a dumb question, but in our physical realm, energy is like a big driver of things, even of the soul. Theoretically, if you go on, past this life, does energy have any impact on artificial intelligence in the digital world, or is there another type of substance or whatever you want to call it that would drive that's similar to energy here?
Well, I have written an awful lot. You mentioned my novel Mindscan, but a number of my novels riff on Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff's notion that consciousness is ultimately quantum mechanical. And I mean, everything ultimately, Einstein said E equals MC squared. You don't have to understand anything about relativity to know that he said fundamentally energy and matter are the same thing. That's what that formula says. but there only is one thing, right? I tend to think that consciousness probably is quantum mechanical. It explains a lot of the conundra related to it, if it is not classical in its physics, but quantum mechanical in its physics. Our greatest and most powerful computers today are nascent, first generation, early model quantum computers. But we will, of course, as we do with every technology, have generation after generation after generation of refinement and improvement. And there's absolutely no reason why a quantum mechanical consciousness couldn't exist just as easily in the quantum computer of our brain, as Roger Penrose, the Roos Ball professor of physics, says, as it could in a quantum computer.
Well, my next question was going to be about quantum mechanics and quantum computing, which I think you have an interest in as well, which I think you just kind of validated right there. What's your vision, I guess, putting your futurist hat on, good or bad, of how humanity will evolve with quantum capabilities in the next decade, just in the next 10 years or so? Do you think it's going to be a very positive impact or mixed bag, or what do you see as some main things coming out of that in the near future?
I am by nature an upbeat person and by profession an optimistic science fiction writer. You know, I was weaned on Gene Roddenberry's vision in the original Star Trek, much more so than I was on any of the more dystopian visions that a lot of modern science fiction has. So my inclination is to think that the world of the future is going to be better than the world of today. Now, the world of today is worse than the world of last year, for sure, because of COVID-19. But the world of today in general, of the 2020s, or the second decade of the 21st century, is way better than the second decade of the 20th century. There's no doubt, as you map backwards throughout time, that every new decade brings a few additional creature comforts, and every new century brings essentially a gigantic leap in the level of overall happiness and health of the human race. And I see no reason to think that that trend is going to abate.
Now, do you see, in terms of like specific quantum capabilities, like, I don't know, education and a chip in your head, or being able to extend life, or whatever, making an uncoordinated guy like me a good athlete? Do you see any type of quantum capabilities helping humans on the human life science side? And then also just in terms of business, how do you see business evolving?
Sure. Absolutely. I do tend to think, I agree with Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff and others, that human consciousness, that the actual awareness and cogitating power of our brains is quantum mechanical in nature. And so I would not be the least bit surprised to find that before my lifetime is over, I have a little quantum computing chip inside my brain. And I went through what many a person of my age went through in the last decade or so. I'm 60. I saw my parents get old and decline. And the number one sign of that decline, neither of them had dementia, thank goodness, but was simply the inability to retrieve information, to remember what they had done that morning, let alone what they had learned 50 years ago. And both of my parents were intellectuals. My father was a PhD. My mother was all but dissertation for her PhD. The idea of having something that would augment my ability to rapidly retrieve and then synthesize information into some sort of coherent opinion or coherent course of action, I think would be wonderfully salutary. And I suspect that it will be a reality, as I say, in the decades that are left of my life, and certainly a reality for children who are already alive today.
Wow. Well, that's a good place to end. But what I do want to end is I want to go back to where we started, which is your book, your first book, The Oppenheimer Alternative. So give us another tease about that, where they can get it, and also where they can find your books on Audible and your website.
Sure. My 24th novel just out, The Oppenheimer Alternative, an alternate history about the Manhattan Project. So you'll probably find it in the science fiction section of your bookstore. If it's not in your local store, of course, they can order it for you, or it's on any of your online booksellers. As you mentioned, there's an audiobook version, and it's available from Audible or iBooks or iTunes, wherever you get your audiobooks. And of course, it's available in all ebook formats as well. My website, I am a science fiction writer, so it's sfwriter.com. S is in science, F is in fiction, writer.com.
Okay, that was just part one of my terrific interview with Robert J. Sawyer. In part two, we dig deeper into some of the futurist trends and even discuss one of Robert's personal paranormal experiences and his favorite sci-fi movie and book. So if you like this episode, which I can't see why you wouldn't, stay tuned. We'll be releasing part two real soon.
You've been listening to the Afraid of Nothing podcast. Please subscribe and like us on Facebook. Until next time, stay scared.
Hey, you're still here? Great. Then why not listen to another episode? Visit AfraidOfNothingPodcast.com to peruse all the shows. That's AfraidOfNothingPodcast.com. And while you're there, click the coffee cup icon to buy me a coffee and leave a review. I'll give you a shout-out in an upcoming episode, and the world will know how swell you are.